Judge mocks elderly black woman in court, shocked to learn she's a genius attorney in disguise. Picture this. The gavel slammed. Reginald Thompson, judge of the Municipal Court of the Eastern District, adjusted his robe, a theatrical gesture he'd practiced in front of his bathroom mirror. He surveyed the courtroom, a pinched expression on his face. He wasn't seeing respect, not the kind he craved. Just boredom, shuffling feet, and the nervous energy of the accused. "Next case," he barked, his voice amplified unnecessarily by the microphone. "Disturbing the peace. Mr. Henderson, I believe?" A skinny man in a stained t-shirt shuffled forward, his eyes downcast. The case was a farce. Henderson had been caught drunkenly singing karaoke at 2 a.m. outside his apartment building. Thompson, however, treated it with the gravity of a national security threat, lecturing Henderson about civic responsibility and the sanctity of sleep. 30 days community service, Mr. Henderson," he declared, relishing the man's crestfallen expression. "And a mandatory sensitivity training session. Next." Sarah Miller, the new prosecuting attorney, shifted nervously beside her seasoned colleague, Mr. Peterson. The courtroom felt stuffy, the air thick with the scent of cheap coffee and anxiety. She scribbled notes, trying to absorb the rhythm of the court, the nuances of Thompson's temperament. "He enjoys this, doesn't he?" she whispered to Peterson. Peterson chuckled, a dry, rustling sound. "Thompson? He's a small man in a big robe, Sarah. This is his kingdom. Let him have his fun." Case after case paraded before Thompson. A parking ticket dispute escalated into a shouting match, a minor shoplifting charge, a neighborhood squabble over a misplaced garbage can. Each was met with Thompson's signature blend of condescension and impatience. He treated the defendants like misbehaving children, his pronouncements laced with thinly veiled contempt. Sarah watched, her initial idealism slowly eroding. This wasn't the pursuit of justice she had envisioned. It felt more like an exercise in power, a public display of Thompson's self-importance. The bailiff called the next case. "Ella Mae Jenkins-Batista, loitering." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Sarah craned her neck, curious. The woman who shuffled tentatively through the doors seemed utterly out of place. She was small and frail, her silver hair pulled back in a loose bun. Her floral dress, though clean, was faded and worn. She clutched a worn, leather-bound book to her chest like a lifeline. Ella Mae Jenkins-Batista looked utterly bewildered. Her eyes, clouded with age, darted around the courtroom, as if she were lost in a foreign land. She shuffled forward, her movements slow and hesitant, and perched precariously on the edge of the defendant's chair. "Ms. Jenkins-Batista," Thompson said, his voice dripping with impatience. "Are you aware of the charges against you?" Ella Mae blinked, her brow furrowed. "Charges, Your Honor? I don't understand." Her voice was a soft, breathy whisper, barely audible above the hum of the courtroom's fluorescent lights. "Loitering," Thompson snapped, rolling his eyes. "You were found sitting on a park bench, refusing to move when asked by a police officer. Do you deny this?" Ella Mae's wrinkled face crinkled further in confusion. "But I was just reading, Your Honor. I wasn't bothering anyone." She held up the book, its pages yellowed and dog-eared. "It's poetry. Walt Whitman." Thompson sighed theatrically. "Ms. Jenkins-Batista, ignorance of the law is no excuse. The park closes at dusk. You were in violation of City Ordinance 42B, subsection 3. Sarah felt a surge of indignation. The woman looked harmless, utterly incapable of posing a threat to anyone. She glanced at Peterson, but he remained impassive, his gaze fixed on the proceedings. "Do you have anything to say in your defense, Ms. Jenkins-Batista?" Thompson asked, his tone dismissive. Ella Mae looked around the courtroom, her eyes filled with a mixture of confusion and fear. She seemed lost, vulnerable, and utterly alone. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a faint, unintelligible sound emerged. Thompson drummed his fingers on the bench. "Well, I haven't got all day." Ella Mae swallowed hard, her small frame trembling slightly. I just wanted to finish the poem, she whispered. It was about hope. Thompson scoffed. Hope? In a park after dark? This isn't a poetry recital, Ms. Jenkins-Batista. This is a court of law. He reached for his gavel, his eyes gleaming with a cruel satisfaction. I find you guilty. 10 days. Before he could finish, Mae Jenkins-Batista straightened her shoulders, a subtle shift in her posture that somehow commanded attention. Her eyes, though still clouded, seemed to sharpen, a flicker of intelligence igniting within them. She took a deep breath, and when she spoke, her voice, though still soft, carried a newfound authority. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice clear and unwavering. I believe you are mistaken. The accusation? The fluorescent lights of courtroom 3 hummed, a monotonous drone that seemed to amplify the tremor in Mae Jenkins-Batista's hands. She clutched her worn handbag, the vinyl cool and slick against her damp palms. The bailiff, a man whose face seemed permanently set in a state of bored disapproval, had directed her to the defendant's table. It felt miles away from the gallery, a vast, exposed space under the weight of Judge Thompson's gaze. Mae Jenkins-Batista, the court clerk's voice echoed, crisp and impersonal. You are charged with violation of Municipal Ordinance 42B, subsection C, commonly referred to as loitering. Specifically, you are accused of remaining in front of Patel's grocery on Elm Street for a period exceeding 15 minutes without demonstrating a clear intent to patronize the establishment, thereby obstructing pedestrian traffic and potentially inhibiting commerce. How do you plead? Mae blinked. The words swam before her, a jumbled mess of legal pronouncements she couldn't quite grasp. I don't understand, she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his expression a mask of thinly veiled impatience. He adjusted his spectacles, the gold frames glinting under the harsh lights. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, he said, his voice amplified by the microphone. Are you pleading guilty or not guilty? It's a simple question. Mae's chest tightened. She hated being put on the spot, hated the feeling of eyes boring into her. She wrung her hands, the knuckles white against the dark vinyl of her bag. I wasn't loitering, she stammered. I was just resting. Thompson sighed, a theatrical sound designed to convey his profound disappointment. Another one, he thought, his gaze drifting over her faded floral dress and sensible shoes. Asterisk probably can't read half the signs on the road. Waste of the court's time. Asterisk he'd seen it 1,000 times. Elderly individuals, confused, overwhelmed by the simplest of legal procedures. He prided himself on his patience, but even the most saintly of judges had their limits. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, he said, his voice dripping with condescension. The ordinance is quite clear. 15 minutes is the limit. Were you or were you not in front of Patel's grocery for longer than 15 minutes? She hesitated, her brow furrowed in concentration. She remembered the warmth of the sun on her face, the scent of spices wafting from the open doorway of the grocery, the brief respite from the ache in her joints. Time had seemed to slip away. Maybe a little longer, she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Thompson puffed out his cheeks. So you admit to violating the ordinance? He looked expectantly at the public defender assigned to her case, a young woman with tired eyes and a stack of files that threatened to topple over. She hadn't even bothered to stand. Clearly, she'd written off this case already. But I wasn't obstructing, Mae insisted, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. There was plenty of room for people to pass. Thompson raised an eyebrow, a gesture that spoke volumes. Asterisk now she's arguing semantics. Asterisk he leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking beneath him. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, the law is the law. We cannot have individuals deciding for themselves which laws they deem worthy of following. He steepled his fingers, his gaze fixed on her. The court recognizes that you may not fully understand the complexities of the situation. Therefore, I'm going to ask you one more time. Do you plead guilty or not guilty? Mae looked around the courtroom, her eyes searching for a friendly face. All she saw were cold stares and impassive expressions. She felt a surge of resentment, a spark of defiance flickering within her. The tremor in her hands lessened. "Not guilty," she said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the hum of the fluorescent lights. Mockery and objection. "So, Miss Jenkins-Batista, you maintain you weren't lingering?" Judge Thompson's voice, a syrup of condescension, coated the courtroom. He leaned back, the springs of his throne of a chair emitting a disgruntled shriek, a performance designed to underscore his power. Through lenses thick as bottle bottoms, his gaze dissected Ella Mae, pinning her like an unwanted specimen. "Perhaps you were critiquing the architecture? Or pondering the philosophical quandaries of pigeons?" A nervous titter rippled through the room. Unmoved, Ella Mae's face, a road map of wrinkles, presented an unreadable calm. "Waiting for the bus, Judge." "The bus, you say? At 11 at night? On a Tuesday? You expect this court to swallow that tale?" A low, guttural chuckle escaped him. "Madam, the buses cease their nocturnal pilgrimages past that corner at, 8 in the evening? That was before I lost my own youthful illusions, some half a century ago. Perhaps time has simply slipped your grasp. A common ailment of, shall we say, seasoned individuals." At the prosecutor's table, Sarah Miller felt a cold dread bloom in her stomach. She'd arrived eager to champion justice, but each day felt like a deeper plunge into ethical quicksand. She glanced at Ella Mae, standing rigidly, her faded dress whispering of past blooms, radiating an unexpected dignity. "The officer's report states you were impeding pedestrian traffic, Miss Jenkins-Batista," Sarah offered, her voice constricted. Not a blatant falsehood, but a calculated manipulation of facts. Officer Davies hadn't cited obstruction, only suspicious presence. She caught Judge Thompson's eye and received a curt, approving nod. He returned his attention to Ella Mae, his tone dripping with mock concern. "And what rejoinder do you have to that, Miss Jenkins-Batista? Besides your implausible claim of being a devotee of late-night public transportation?" Ella Mae didn't so much as twitch. "I wasn't blocking nobody. Plenty of space to walk around. That officer just took a dislike to the looks of me." Thompson sighed, a performance of weary patience. "Ah, here it is. The familiar refrain. Playing the race card, are we? How predictable. You know, Miss Jenkins-Batista, perhaps if you weren't idling at ungodly hours, people wouldn't find you so objectionable, to use your poignant phrasing." A wave of heat climbed Sarah's neck. She loathed this charade, Thompson's blatant disregard for fairness, his apparent delight in tormenting this aged woman. Most of all, she despised her own participation. "Judge," she began, her voice barely audible. "With respect." "Speak up, Miss Miller!" Thompson snapped, his feigned amiability dissolving. Sarah swallowed, the lump in her throat making it a painful exercise. "I object to the court's examination. It's argumentative and prejudicial." Silence descended, thick and heavy. Thompson's face flushed crimson. The gavel crashed down, the sharp report echoing like a gunshot. "Are you challenging my authority, Miss Miller?" "No, sir, but—" "Silence! I will not suffer insolence in my courtroom. One more utterance, and I'll cite you for contempt. Is that understood?" His glare could have melted steel. Sarah met his gaze, jaw clenched. The flame of her youthful idealism flickered, threatened by a bitter wind of reality. "Yes, sir," she mumbled, her voice devoid of conviction. Thompson turned back to Ella Mae, satisfaction glinting in his eyes. "Now, Miss Jenkins-Batista, where were we?" "Ah, yes. Your flagrant disregard for civic ordinances. I find you guilty of loitering. A fine of $50 or 3 days in the county jail." Ella Mae faced him squarely, her gaze unwavering. "Don't have $50, Judge? Then you'll be our guest for 3 days, Miss Jenkins-Batista. Bailiff, take her into custody." As the bailiff escorted Ella Mae away, a dizzying wave of revulsion swept over Sarah. Watching the old woman's receding figure, the slump of her shoulders, the deliberate, weary steps, she felt a profound sense of culpability settle upon her. The scales of justice, she thought with crushing certainty, were tipped beyond repair. She knew, with a sickening clarity, that she had betrayed the very principle she swore to uphold. Representing herself. "You insult the court's intelligence, Mrs. Jenkins-Batista," Judge Thompson thundered, his complexion mottled. The reprimand echoed, polluting the courtroom air, a stagnant blend of aged documents and brewing resentment. "A final statement before sentencing?" Mae Jenkins-Batista, spine rigid, met his glare unflinchingly. Insults, the dismissive tone, seemed to deflect harmlessly from her resolve. Nearby, Sarah Miller, the prosecutor, fidgeted. The smooth surface of her desk felt suddenly abrasive. This felt wrong. Loitering? On a park bench? Unconscionable. "Yes, Your Honor," Ms. Jenkins-Batista replied, her voice a calm ripple against the judge's roar. "I wish to act as my own counsel." A rustle of disbelief swept through the room. Heads pivoted. Sarah nearly aspirated her water. Represent herself? Against Thompson? A lamb volunteering for slaughter. Thompson's brows vaulted upwards, vanishing momentarily beneath his thinning hair. A predatory glint sparked in his gaze, veiled by a self-satisfied grin. Delicious. He loved this theater. An effortless triumph, an exhibition of his legal acumen. This diminutive woman, in her humble dress and subdued manner, dared challenge him? Absurd. He relished the silence, a tightening coil of suspense. "You comprehend the charges, Mrs. Jenkins-Batista?" he finally inquired, his voice oozing false solicitude. "Loitering. Obstructing justice. Disturbing the peace." "I do, Your Honor." "And you persist in foregoing legal representation? You are aware of your right to a court-appointed defender?" "Perfectly aware, Your Honor." "I waive that right." Her gaze held his, unwavering, radiating unforeseen fortitude. Thompson settled back, complacency etched onto his features. This was almost too simple. Victory felt palpable. He envisioned headlines championing his firm stance on law and order, picturing himself recounting this triumph to his country club peers, the dolt he effortlessly bested. "Very well," he proclaimed, his voice booming anew. "The court acknowledges your request. Mrs. Jenkins-Batista will proceed pro se." He struck the gavel, the resounding crack a punctuation mark on his petty display of authority. Sarah Miller felt a tightening in her gut. She knew Thompson's hunger for domination, his towering ego. This wasn't justice, it was a power grab. She glanced at Ms. Jenkins-Batista, a flicker of unease competing with reluctant admiration. The woman possessed courage, undeniable courage. But courage was no match for Thompson. She had to intervene. But how? She watched as Ms. Jenkins-Batista adjusted her spectacles with measured grace, a subtle smile gracing her lips. Something gleamed in her eyes, intellect, perhaps even amusement. It was unsettling, like a mouse winking at a predator. Oblivious to Sarah's inner conflict, Thompson launched into a diatribe concerning the vital importance of upholding laws, the sacredness of public areas, the defendant's blatant disregard for societal norms. He glanced at the vacant jury box, inwardly praising his own acumen. No jury required for such a straightforward case. He was the ultimate arbiter, poised to deliver justice with theatrical flair. Sarah couldn't quell the feeling that something was deeply amiss. Ms. Jenkins-Batista lacked the demeanor of someone facing certain defeat. A quiet self-assurance radiated from her, an inexplicable undercurrent. Perhaps this case contained hidden depths. A sliver of hope, fragile and new, pushed through Sarah's apprehension. Perhaps this wouldn't be the complete perversion of justice she anticipated. But she knew, instinctively, that whatever was coming next would shake the room. The tide turns. Mae Jenkins-Batista stood, her floral dress, once a beacon of color, now appeared faded, a visual echo of her initial dejection. She nudged her glasses up her nose, the delicate chain snagging on a wispy strand of silver. "Your Honor," she began, her voice a mere whisper. "I've never done anything like this before." Reginald Thompson, a fleshy smirk playing across his face, leaned back. He'd witnessed this tableau countless times, a defendant, intimidated, buckling under the system's immense pressure. He anticipated her collapse with undisguised relish. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, having chosen to represent yourself, are you prepared to proceed? Each syllable dripped with contempt. A hesitant cough drifted through the hushed courtroom. Even the young prosecutor, Abernathy, rustled his papers, a fleeting expression of pity crossing his features. Ella Mae took a breath, her gaze fixed somewhere beyond the jury box, lost in thought. Yes, Your Honor. I am. A subtle shift occurred. Her dress seemed to regain some of its lost vivacity. Very well, Thompson declared, his voice echoing in the room. Call your first witness. She paused, her fingers caressing the worn leather binding of a hefty book, a new and surprising addition to the scene. Your Honor, with the court's indulgence, I request permission to cross-examine Officer Davies. Several assertions in his earlier testimony require some clarification. Thompson's eyebrow arched in surprise at the newfound steel in her voice. Abernathy visibly tensed. Ella Mae moved with newfound purpose toward the witness stand, her eyes, magnified by the lenses, sharp with determination. Officer Davies, she began, her voice now resonant with unexpected strength. You testified that you personally observed me, struggling with the alleged victim over a handbag. Is that a truthful statement? Davies, a stout man with a perpetually ruddy complexion, nodded curtly. Yes, ma'am. I witnessed it myself. From what distance were you making these observations? Approximately 20 feet, ma'am. And what was your position relative to the incident? Did you have a clear view, or was it from an angle? Davies shifted uncomfortably in his seat. From an angle, ma'am. I was approaching from the east. So your line of sight was somewhat compromised? Objection! Abernathy interjected. Leading the witness. Sustained. Thompson snapped, his earlier amusement evaporating. Ella Mae simply nodded, unfazed by the interruption. Officer Davies, can you describe the handbag in detail? Its dimensions, its composition, its hue? Davies stammered slightly, his composure faltering. It was a brown, leather bag. Average size, I suppose? Average size? Ella Mae echoed, a ghost of a smile gracing her lips. And can you recall what the alleged victim was wearing? The flush on Davies's face deepened. I don't recall precisely. You don't recall? A rather significant detail, considering the nature of the alleged crime and the bright light? Let me jog your memory, officer. Your own report states the victim was wearing a bright yellow dress. A rather conspicuous garment, wouldn't you agree? Hard to miss, one might say. Davies mumbled something unintelligible, avoiding her gaze. Now, officer, Ella Mae pressed, her voice gaining traction. Isn't it true that this handbag, the object of this purported violent struggle, possessed a long shoulder strap? A strap that would have rendered it exceedingly difficult for someone of my age and build to forcibly snatch it without a rather messy entanglement? Wouldn't you agree that the combined weight of the bag, the resistance of the strap, and the alleged victim's own grip would have made such a clean snatch highly improbable? Abernathy bolted to his feet. Objection! Pure speculation! Thompson shot Ella Mae a dark look, a visible pulse throbbing at his temple. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, confine your questions to the established facts. But, Your Honor, I am merely exploring the logistical impracticalities of the officer's testimony. She turned back to Davies, her gaze unwavering. Officer, your report alleges I fled the scene. Yet isn't it equally true that I remained at the scene, peacefully awaiting your arrival? Davies's silence hung like a shroud in the courtroom. Abernathy's face had lost all color. Thompson squirmed in his chair, the smug complacency replaced by a prickling sense of unease. The balance of power was undeniably shifting. Unlikely allies. The air in the courtroom, thick with anticipation and a faint scent of old paper and simmering resentment, crackled. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, no longer the picture of downtrodden despair, stood ramrod straight. Her voice, once a hesitant whisper, now resonated with the force of a gathering storm. With all due respect, Your Honor, she began, her gaze fixed on Judge Thompson, whose smug demeanor had begun to fray around the edges. The prosecution's entire case hinges on the alleged eyewitness account of Mr. Clarence Peabody. However, she paused, a glint of steel in her eye. Mr. Peabody's statement, entered into evidence as Exhibit A, contradicts itself on 3 separate occasions regarding the precise time of the incident, the color of the getaway vehicle, and most crucially, the alleged perpetrator's height. Furthermore, she continued, her voice gaining momentum, Mr. Peabody was, at the time of the incident, demonstrably under the influence of a significant amount of dandelion wine, rendering his testimony highly unreliable. Thompson shifted in his seat, the leather creaking in protest. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, he said, his voice tight, I must remind you that you are proceeding without legal counsel. I urge you to reconsider accepting the plea bargain offered by the prosecution. A ripple of surprised murmurs went through the gallery. Even Sarah felt a prickle of unease. Something about Thompson's insistence felt forced. Ms. Jenkins-Batista ignored the judge's interruption. And that's not all, Your Honor. The warrant used to search my client's home was based solely on Mr. Peabody's dubious testimony. I submit that the warrant was obtained without probable cause, rendering the subsequent search and seizure illegal and any evidence obtained inadmissible. She punctuated her statement with a firm nod. Sarah felt a jolt. The woman was right. The warrant, it had been rushed through. She remembered the frantic phone call from Thompson, the unusual pressure to expedite the process. She glanced at the file in front of her, suddenly seeing it with fresh, critical eyes. Doubts, like insidious vines, began to coil around her professional conscience. During a brief recess, Sarah approached Ms. Jenkins-Batista while she was conferring quietly with a worried-looking young man in the gallery. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, Sarah said, her voice low, trying to sound professional. Regarding the admissibility of the evidence, I believe the case of Mapp v. Ohio might be relevant to your argument. She scribbled a quick note on a scrap of paper, outlining the key points of the exclusionary rule. Ms. Jenkins-Batista looked at Sarah. Her eyes, though weary, held a spark of intelligence and what felt, strangely, like gratitude. Thank you, Ms. Miller, she replied, her voice quiet but firm. She took the note, her fingers brushing Sarah's momentarily. I appreciate your assistance. Back in the courtroom, Ms. Jenkins-Batista, armed with the Mapp v. Ohio citation, continued her methodical dismantling of the prosecution's case. Your Honor, she declared, her voice ringing with newfound authority. The evidence obtained from my client's home is fruit of the poisonous tree. It should be suppressed. Thompson's face was a mask of barely suppressed fury. He banged his gavel with undue force. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, I will not tolerate these theatrics. You are abusing the court's time. I am merely defending my client, Your Honor, as is my right, she retorted, her voice unwavering. Sarah watched, her heart pounding. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was witnessing something extraordinary, something profoundly unjust being challenged by an unlikely champion. She discreetly passed another note to Ms. Jenkins-Batista, this time regarding a potential violation of due process. The judge hadn't allowed the defendant time to seek counsel. It was a long shot, but it was something. Thompson noticed the exchange. His eyes narrowed. Ms. Miller, he barked, I suggest you focus on your own responsibilities. Sarah swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. Of course, Your Honor, she replied, her voice barely audible. But as she watched Ms. Jenkins-Batista continue her passionate defense, a quiet rebellion began to bloom within her. She knew, with a growing certainty, that she could not stand idly by and allow this charade to continue. The courtroom felt charged, the temperature had risen, it was too hot to be comfortable. The truth would be revealed. The revelation. Ms. Jenkins, the prosecutor drawled, adjusting his silk tie, a self-satisfied smirk etched on his face. You'd have us believe you were ignorant of the contract's fine print, claiming you were, and I quote, taken advantage of. Isn't the simpler truth, Ms. Jenkins, that you couldn't be bothered to read it? Ella Mae Jenkins sat perfectly erect, her gaze steady as bedrock. The weary slump that had characterized her during the initial proceedings had evaporated, supplanted by an unyielding resolve. I read what was presented to me, sir. The final agreement never crossed my sight. Indeed? And where's your proof of this alleged substitution? The prosecutor's tone dripped venom. Judge Thompson, who had been jovial earlier, now tapped his pen against the mahogany desk, a subtle disquiet replacing his mirth. He'd anticipated a swift victory for the prosecution, a tidy end to this farce. Now, a shiver of unease crept down his spine. My notes, detailing the initial terms, sir. Email trails confirming said terms. And forthcoming witness testimony, of course. Her voice, newly imbued with power, resonated with crisp confidence. The prosecutor scoffed, dismissing her claims with a wave of his hand. Notes? Emails? Hardly airtight. It's your word against the corporate giants, Ms. Jenkins. And unfortunately for you, your word carries little currency here. Ella Mae inhaled deeply, drawing strength from the air around her. Perhaps you're right. Maybe the declaration of a seemingly unassuming, elderly woman, easily dismissed, doesn't register much. But I assure you, my voice has resonated within vastly more significant halls. Oh? And which illustrious chambers might those be? He arched an eyebrow, playing to the spectators, who were anticipating a spectacle of incompetence. Ella Mae met his gaze, the years of experience reflected in their depths. The halls of justice. The arenas of equality. The forums where the unheard find their voices amplified. A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. Even Judge Thompson shifted, visibly perturbed. And how exactly have you frequented these arenas, Ms. Jenkins? The prosecutor pressed, sensing a shift in the atmosphere, an electric tension he couldn't quite grasp. Ella Mae straightened her shoulders, her gaze encompassing the courtroom, lingering on each face, the onlookers, the jury, the increasingly flustered judge. My name is not simply Ella Mae Jenkins. The courtroom stilled, every breath held captive. My name is Ella Mae Jenkins-Batista. The effect was instantaneous and earth-shattering. A collective gasp filled the air. The prosecutor stumbled back, his complexion paling. Judge Thompson's pen clattered to the floor, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Ella Mae Jenkins-Batista, she continued, her voice now a clarion call, is a name that has championed justice for decades. A name that has challenged discrimination, defended the vulnerable, and fought relentlessly for the marginalized. A name synonymous with landmark victories, the overturning of unjust laws, and the inspiration of countless legal minds. She paused, allowing her words to resonate. I am a civil rights attorney, a Yale Law School graduate, a recipient of the Thurgood Marshall Lifetime Achievement Award. And I have been deliberately underestimated, purposely overlooked, and systematically dismissed in this very courtroom, all because of a perceived frailty. Pandemonium erupted. The courtroom was a cacophony of disbelief and shock. The prosecutor stammered, struggling to regain control, his voice swallowed by the din. Judge Thompson hammered his gavel, the sound barely audible above the rising wave of whispers. Ella Mae stood tall, an emblem of unwavering defiance amid the chaos. The transformation was complete. The seemingly harmless, vulnerable woman had vanished, replaced by a formidable legal titan, prepared to fight for her rights, and to expose the insidious prejudice that had attempted to silence her. Justice served. Judge Thompson worried the gavel, the polished wood damp against his clammy palm. The air of self-importance had dissipated, leaving a sickly apprehension that clung to him like a damp fog. He cleared his throat, the sound booming in the sudden, hushed stillness of the courtroom. Ms. Jenkins, Batista, he began, stumbling over her name for what he hoped was the last time. Given new information that has come to light, and after reconsideration of the evidence, it appears there may have been an error in judgment. He averted his gaze, focusing on a spot high above the entrance, as if searching for divine intervention. At the prosecutor's table, Sarah Miller felt a coil of anxiety unwind in her gut. Sleepless hours had been spent wrestling with guilt, a growing belief she stood on the wrong side of the line. It was she who had quietly, anonymously, funneled Ms. Jenkins-Batista the details exposing Thompson's web of deceit, a trail of dubious land deals and suspiciously large campaign donations. Her fingers, hidden from view, trembled almost imperceptibly. Therefore, Thompson pressed on, the word catching like a fishbone. The court feels obligated to offer Ms. Jenkins-Batista an apology for any undue hardship or disrespect endured. Furthermore, all charges are dropped with immediate effect. He brought the gavel down, the sound flat and final. A ripple of astonishment spread through the gallery, followed by a silence so profound it felt like a held breath. Ms. Jenkins-Batista unfolded from her chair with purposeful grace. The simple dress she'd chosen now seemed like an artful deception, a cocoon from which strength had emerged. Her spine was ramrod straight, her gaze steady and unwavering. She fixed Judge Thompson with her eyes, reflecting not triumph, not anger, but a clear sense of right. "Thank you, Your Honor," she stated, her voice clear and strong, resonating through the room. "But this isn't about me. It's about the countless others, especially those from vulnerable communities, who are routinely met with prejudice and disdain within these walls." She turned, her gaze encompassing the gallery, connecting with each individual. "Justice is not a luxury, it is a birthright. It is not a commodity to be bought or sold. It is the very foundation of our society, the solemn pledge upon which this nation was built. Yet, for too many, that promise remains broken." A pause, her eyes shimmering with barely suppressed emotion. "We must demand more. We must demand equity. We must demand respect for every person, regardless of age, ethnicity, background, or creed. We must hold power accountable and ensure the scales are truly balanced." Her words hung in the air, potent with truth and righteous fury. She spoke of her parents, trailblazers in the civil rights movement of the Deep South, of their sacrifices, of their hopes for a more just tomorrow. She spoke of the children she represented, children deserving of opportunity yet often denied it because of skin tone or postcode. "This courtroom," she declared, her voice resonating with conviction, "should be a beacon of hope, a sanctuary where justice prevails. Not a stage for bigotry and petty power plays. Today, let us all remember that the fight for justice knows no end. It demands constant vigilance, unwavering courage, and an unwavering belief in the intrinsic worth of every human life." A solitary clap pierced the silence, then another, and another, until the courtroom exploded with deafening applause. People surged to their feet, cheering, their faces animated with emotion. Some wept freely, tears of relief, gratitude, and renewed hope. Even Sarah Miller found herself applauding, her heart hammering with a sense of newfound conviction. Judge Thompson remained seated, his face strained of color, his hands shaking visibly. The roar of applause crashed over him, a relentless tide of censure. He had underestimated Mae Jenkins-Batista, and in doing so, he had laid bare his own corruption and prejudice for all to witness. Justice, at long last, had found its voice. A lasting impact. The applause began tentatively, a scattering of claps that swiftly coalesced into a resonant, sustained ovation. Ms. Jenkins-Batista, head held high, betrayed no reaction. Instead, she retrieved her time-worn satchel, the brass clasp winking in the light, and turned toward the exit. Sarah's heart soared as the gallery erupted. Lawyers, reporters, even a few court clerks, all on their feet, their faces illuminated by admiration and, Sarah suspected, a touch of vicarious defiance. A tangible buzz filled the air, the collective release after prolonged constraint. Judge Thompson, however, remained planted, a flush creeping up his neck like a rising tide. His grip on the bench tightened, knuckles bone-white. He stared rigidly ahead, avoiding all eye contact, the habitual smugness replaced by a raw disquiet. Sarah could almost hear the frantic calculations whirring in his brain. Decades of carefully constructed reputation were crumbling to dust. At the courtroom doors, Ms. Jenkins-Batista paused, a silent monolith. No dramatic turn, no parting shot. Her very stillness, her indomitable presence, communicated everything. A declaration, a promise, a gauntlet thrown. Then, with a final, resolute movement, she vanished, leaving the echoes of the ovation to linger in the ensuing, breathless quiet. A hand rested on Sarah's shoulder. David, his face a canvas of relief and something bordering on reverence. "You did the right thing, Sarah," he rasped, his voice thick with emotion. "That was incredibly brave." She offered a wan smile. "Ms. Jenkins-Batista was the brave one. I just spoke the truth." But voicing that truth had felt like a Herculean feat. The burden of secrecy, the dread of the consequences, had been suffocating. Now, in the wake of revelation, she felt unburdened, lighter than air. Judge Thompson shifted in his seat. He cleared his throat, the sound booming across the suddenly hushed space. "This court is adjourned," he announced, his voice stripped of its usual overbearing authority. A curt, almost humbled pronouncement. He avoided Sarah's gaze as he retreated from the bench, disappearing into the sanctuary of his chambers. The courtroom emptied in a rush, a flurry of excited voices receding into the distance. Sarah lingered, her gaze drawn to the now vacant space where Ms. Jenkins-Batista had stood. She pictured the woman's quiet power, the unwavering belief that had propelled her. It was more than shrewd lawyering. It was a lifetime dedicated to justice, an unyielding refusal to be silenced or ignored. A surge of renewed purpose washed over Sarah. She had been on the precipice of despair, disillusioned by the corruption she had witnessed, doubting her own ability to effect change. But Ms. Jenkins-Batista had demonstrated that one person, even seemingly powerless, could challenge the establishment. She had ignited a spark of hope, a stark reminder that the fight was always worth fighting. Straightening her spine, her resolve solidified. There would undoubtedly be repercussions. Judge Thompson would have let such an affront slide. But she would not capitulate. She would not allow fear to dictate her choices. She owed it to herself, to Ms. Jenkins-Batista, and to all those victimized by Judge Thompson's abuse of authority. Sarah exited the courtroom, the weight of her confession shed, replaced by a blossoming sense of direction. The city air possessed a new clarity, a sharper tang. The sky seemed infinitely more vibrant. The journey ahead would be arduous, but she was no longer treading it alone. The profound impact of Mae Jenkins-Batista's understated revolution was already taking root, not only within those courtroom walls, but within the heart of a young woman prepared to confront the world.